Chapter 47. The Impossible Journal. Twilight was beside herself. In a turn of events that she could never have prepared for, Starlight had just delivered to her the journal that had been by her side since the day she left Canterlot. There was no doubt that it was the genuine article. The way the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed, the distinctive curl and her C's and S's, all of it was a perfect match to her own penmanship. Though there was one thing in particular that didn't match up as Twilight actually took the time to read the words that she had clearly written.
Journal entry number 343, May 16th, year 1011 on the Grand Celestial Calendar. It's been 4 days since Spike and I have begun our latest expedition for dragons in the Badlands, far to the south of Equestria's borders, with very little to show for it. Unfortunately, I'm starting to think that the stories I overheard from that charlatan in Klugtown were largely exaggerated. Oddly specific life advice: when an individual has the word dapper in their name, take everything they say with a grain of salt or two. But Spike was insistent that we at least investigate, and had been hoping that we'd at least be able to see another dragon, so here we are. Looking back in hindsight, that catfolk's tall tales might have been part of some larger scam in the long run, and it was only just last night that Spike and I accidentally stumbled on a camp of bandits, situated in a large cave, one that looked suspiciously perfect for draconic nesting grounds. Thankfully, we managed to slink away without being noticed, but the experience was more than enough to tell us both that we had been deceived. Not surprising, Klugtown is a place filled with unsavory individuals who would love to get their hooves, paws, claws, hands, appendages on a dragon's hoard, and Capper must have seen me as just an easy mark. The realization has made Spike more than a little anxious about this whole situation, and I'm starting to get a little worried about him. But moving on, even if the reason Spike and I came all the way out here was less than credible, the environment itself seems to support the claim that dragons could be found in the region. The mountains would provide more than enough natural cave systems or room to carve them out for dragons to make their homes, and the distinctive scent of sulfur suggests that at least one of them is volcanic in nature, both of which are traits of a dragon's natural habitat. On a slightly unrelated note, Spike is absolutely enthralled by the smell, even after last night's upsetting revelation. This is probably a byproduct of his natural instincts, and his excitement over maybe finding dragons at long last. Though in spite of the evidence we've found, I'm beginning to doubt that there are any dragons other than Spike here. Of the cave systems that we've looked into, outside of the one having the bandits, we haven't found any sign of dragons being here. No territorial claw marks, no shedded scales, nothing. The rations we brought along for this expedition are starting to dwindle. We have a few days' worth of food left at best, and we're pretty far away from the nearest town. I promised we'd search one last cave or two before we began making our way back to civilization to supply and regroup. Thankfully, the amulet's finally recharged, and I caught sight of a route not too far from here, so at the very least we won't have to travel very far. It's not going to be long before Spike's up and demanding we get to the next cave, so I should end this entry here. He really wants to see if we'll find anything, and after last night's upsetting discovery, I'm at least hoping there's a few discarded scales. I'll provide more details of the expedition's conclusion in the next memo, but I should get a move on. Either we'll find what we're looking for, or we'll leave empty-handed. Or clawed, in his case.
This was her journal. There was no hiding or denying that. But the events described in it were largely inaccurate. Just different enough from Twilight's recollection of those days to make her wonder. Quicker than any bolt of lightning could ever hope to fly, she reached into her saddlebags with her magic, pulling out her journal, tucked into the pack's depths. the very same journal that Starlight had just given her. At least Twilight's journal hadn't been outright stolen from under her nose, though that fear had already been taken off the table from the differing descriptions held in Starlight's copy. Twilight opened her own journal to the same page Starlight had pulled up. And just like that, the differences became far more apparent. There was no mention of a catfolk named Dapper, or how they stumbled upon some bandits' camp, which was far more accurate to what had actually transpired. Out of curiosity, Twilight took Starlight's edition and flipped it backwards from that point, skimming through more of the contents that she supposedly wrote. And each new entry she read through gave her the same feeling as the first one. All of them were painfully familiar, as if she had written them, but the events just weren't quite right. Some of the described events were only slightly different from what she remembered and what she had written, while others described scenarios that could only have happened if Twilight had made different decisions than the ones she had made. Now and again, she flipped back to one that was perfectly matching what had actually happened, adding to her growing confusion. Finally, Twilight snapped both books shut and began rotating them in the air, taking care not to get them mixed up, and studied them, looking for any differences. To her surprise, there weren't many. Where Twilight had been irritatingly stained at some point in time, the same spot tarnished Starlight's duplicate. Small scratches and dings on one perfectly matched up with the other. The only differences Twilight could find were, strangely enough, a few minor scratches on Starlight's book that weren't present on Twilight's. But everything else matched, far too perfectly to be mere coincidence. Too perfect to even be counterfeits.
This is either a really bad fake or a really good one,
Twilight admitted absent-mindedly, putting her journal away and turning to Starlight.
How did you make it? Wrong on both accounts, and I didn't.
Starlight's answer was cold and sterile.
It's your journal. Every word was written by you. No, it isn't. I have my journal.
Twilight gestured to her saddlebags, before tossing the fake at Starlight's hooves.
This? It isn't. Well, it is. You wrote every single word in that book, I can promise you that.
Starlight lifted the book she had provided and carefully dusted it off.
Things just might not have lined up the same way this time around. You could call this the first draft.
Once again, Starlight wasn't making any sense. But this took that to an otherworldly extreme. Starlight had been ranting and raving about how she had done this before, how Twilight could have chosen to walk away this time around, and how this accurately inaccurate journal was described as being the first draft. The gears were spinning in Twilight's head, working to try and unravel this enigma. And with each second, there was only one answer that seemed to make any sense, impossible as it may have sounded.
Are you trying to tell me that you're from the future?
Equal parts irritation and curiosity shone through in her question, the strangest one she had ever had to ask.
That is an oversimplification of a very complicated issue.
Starlight leaned into the wall.
I could spend years talking about the metaphysics behind my existence, but yes, I suppose the short version of it all is that I'm from a future. One that's not possible anymore, but still a future.
That statement was equal parts irritating and enlightening, and Twilight's scowl made that very clear.
That doesn't make any sense. Well, forgive me if I touch a nerve, but neither does Queen Celestia giving some seemingly random individual a second chance at life through Alicorn Ascension.
Starlight retorted with an impossibly straightforward tone.
I learned a very, very long time ago that life chooses to not make sense at the most inconvenient of times.
Twilight's eye twitched angrily at the reminder of her ascension. At this point, it wasn't possible to be caught off guard by Starlight's intimate knowledge of Twilight's past, but that didn't make it any easier to be reminded of it. Twilight took a slow, deep breath, calming her anger, and leaving only a smoldering frustration in its place.
Okay, fair enough,
Twilight bitterly admitted.
So, if you're really from some impossible future, would you care to explain what it is you're doing here in the first place?
As if for the millionth time that day, Starlight gave another long, tired sigh, like she were a deflating balloon. Much like Twilight's thoughts on her alicorn ascension, the subject appeared to be a point of contention for Starlight.
I don't even know where to begin. It was so long ago. Long ago. Relatively speaking. Start from the beginning. The beginning? Alright, I guess.
Another disgruntled moan, this one filtered by her upper row of teeth and her bottom lip.
Well, I guess it all really started back when I found the temporal gateway spell. It's just kind of something I stumbled on and took interest in. I didn't actually take it, I just took a few photos. Made it easier to not get caught.
Twilight scoffed, raising an eyebrow in skepticism.
You just stumbled on the ability to travel through time. Well, it was in a library, or like more of an archive, depending on how you look at it. Top floor, highest security.
It was at this point that Starlight broke eye contact, her eyes trailing upwards and to the right, as a look of embarrassed shame came over her.
I wasn't really supposed to be there.
Twilight's brow furrowed. The idea that this mare was a thief was the most believable thing she had heard so far, though there did seem to be some semblance of regret hanging over her that didn't justify the actions in the first place. The next subject was, of course, how Starlight had stolen it in the first place, but Twilight didn't really see a point in pressing that right now. The place that she had stolen it from probably just didn't have very good security. Either that or Starlight was really good. But in the end, Twilight was more interested in the results of that heist.
And you were able to just cast something like that? It took me a few years of decoding to figure it out. Not to mention gathering all of the material components for the ritual and testing it out on a much smaller scale. And I had some help. From a friend.
Starlight's words slowly trickled off into silence. She slowly turned her attention to the floor, and the life in her eyes visibly faded away. Much like before, when a humorous piece of nostalgia brought her some joy, this time she recalled something that resulted in sorrow.
Sunburst kept telling me it was a bad idea. That we shouldn't have been doing it. I should have listened to him when I had the chance.
Starlight fell quiet for a few moments, before suddenly jerking back up to attention.
It goes without saying, but he didn't talk me out of it. But he at least insisted I bring something along with me, so I wasn't entirely lost. And that's why you have my journal. First rule of going on a road trip? Bring a map. Sound logic.
Twilight nodded slowly, parsing this new information with a bitter expression.
So you stole it from me?
Like a scarecrow in a field, Starlight froze. Her eyes practically bored into Twilight's skull with how intense her stare was. She was visibly twitching, and jittering as the silence persisted. Sweat gathered on her brow as her cheeks puffed up. She was holding her breath. Whatever the answer to Twilight's question was, Starlight clearly didn't want to give it. It looked like she was on the verge of another of her nervous breakdowns. Frustrated by this development, Twilight quietly growled to herself before going to press the issue.
Did you? Okay, there's no sugarcoating this. I stole it just like I stole the spell.
The question was cut off immediately by a hasty response, given in a single breath.
I mean, I was going to put it back when I was done. Back when I thought I'd actually be able to go home. But that's not possible. So I'm a thief. Happy?
The admittance to stealing the journal was the first thing Twilight believed without a second thought. But the more she thought about this story, the more the dots began to connect in her head. From the moment they had met, Starlight had acted in very strange ways around Twilight. Ways that she only really could have been acting if she had some sort of foresight. Apologizing to Twilight for everything the first time they had met, all the way to yesterday, when she showed up out of the blue to point Twilight in Spike's direction. One explanation would be the use of divination magic. Twilight wouldn't be surprised if Starlight had some knowledge in that art, but that didn't explain Starlight's knowledge of her personal affairs. The duplicate journal went a long way to describing that, but there was no logical explanation as to how she could have gotten it. The only time she could have gotten a copy was the night she had wiped Spike's memories, but that had happened after they had first met. It also didn't justify the numerous alterations made to the entries. What in the world could she have to gain from making those kinds of edits? Then there was Starlight's reluctance to talk about all of this in the first place. If this was all meant to be some elaborate cover story, why go to such lengths to deny it? Maybe to sell the illusion of it being a far-fetched tale that Twilight wouldn't believe, but at that point, why not just make a more believable alibi? One that didn't require all of this. As she thought, Twilight made it a point not to break eye contact with Starlight. She watched for any crack in her persona, any sign that this was all some elaborate ruse, a sob story to get Twilight to stop asking questions and get back to what she wanted her to do. But no such sign came. All Twilight saw staring back at her were the tired eyes of a defeated mare. A mare who, as she had said, had lost everyone and everything she had ever known or cared about. And in a moment of either foolishness or kindness, Twilight hadn't decided which it was yet, she found herself believing that, if nothing else, the explanation that was being given was real to Starlight. Real enough, at least.
You're not making this up, are you?
Even now, Twilight had her doubts, but they were being overpowered by her bleeding heart, as she'd been calling it the past few days. Starlight just shook her head. No further explanation, no attempts to deny or bolster the story. Just a little expression that spoke louder than any words could. It didn't stop Twilight from continuing her interrogation, though, as there was still one piece of this puzzle that needed to be put in its place.
Why did you do it? What?
Starlight flinched at the question.
Why did you do it? You had a reason, right? Someone doesn't just go around stealing from archives and alicorns without a good reason. Especially when you have a friend telling you to stop.
Twilight didn't raise her voice as she spoke. She kept herself calm and collected.
So, why did you do it?
Something in Starlight shifted. An emotional weight bore down on her enough to make her sag even more than she already was. Her face became visibly strained as her inner turmoil came to the surface. Tears began to well up in her eyes, and her breasts became ragged with emotion as she struggled to find the words. A series of pain-choking sounds came from her, as if she were about to break into sobs. But before either mare could continue, a rumbling quake shook the dilapidated tower. The emotional tension was shattered like glass as the tremor came and went without any warning. Starlight perked up and ran to the window, perking her head outside and glaring upward.
I thought we had more time.
Starlight bit her lower lip and let out a concerned groan, looking back to Twilight with an exasperated expression.
I'm sorry, but we need to get a move on. We're running out of time.
Twilight had to bite back the urge to growl at this development. While Starlight's story practically demanded further investigation, there was no denying that the earthquake needed her attention. The Twilight didn't even get a chance to question what was happening before Starlight was on the move again. In a blur, she raced back to the dusty old desk and scooped up the box stolen from Knox. Doubling back around, Twilight braced herself as Starlight charged her like a bull.
Sorry about this!
Starlight shouted frantically as she leapt towards her. There wasn't any time to react to the situation, and Twilight found herself being tackled to the ground by the frenzied unicorn. Before she could even hit the floor, though, a blinding flash of blue light overwhelmed her senses, as Starlight's teleportation spell once again whisked them away. To where? Twilight did not know.